Why is church important? Well, church is important because it's important to God. The church is the assembly of God's people. It's the grouping, it's the assembly of the people of God. And it has always been God's desire and God's plan to dwell with and among His people. We see that in the Garden of Eden. He created Adam and Eve, and He created a garden for them. He made a garden for them to dwell in, for them to dwell together. In the tabernacle, when God gave Moses the instructions for the tabernacle, He told him to make a tabernacle, and in this tabernacle the very presence of God would dwell, the Shekinah glory. And that tabernacle was to be placed in the very center of the camp of Israel. Later on, when they created the temple, the tabernacle became permanent, there was the same idea that God was placed, His presence was dwelling in the very center of His people, in and among His people. When Israel fell into sin and fell into idolatry and they were exiled from the land of Israel, the temple was destroyed. Before that happened, the Shekinah glory left the temple. But it was prophesied that God's presence would come back, that the glory would come back, which it did in the person of Jesus. Because in Jesus, the glory of God dwelt, we're told in John chapter 1. So when Jesus came back to dwell among His people, He instituted the church, which was the assembly of God. And in the New Testament, the church is called the bride of Christ. In the book of Revelation, Jesus is pictured in the midst of the churches, in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. And so it shows us that God's attention, His focus, His love, His affection is upon His church, and He dwells in and among His church. He calls it, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul calls the church the temple of God, and that is where the presence of God dwells. It is the bride of Christ. The church is his place of affection, is what He has put His affection upon. And so what's important to Jesus should be important to us. There is no call to a life that's apart from or out from the community of believers, because that's where God's presence dwells, that's where His glory dwells, and that's where His affection is. It's upon His church. So the Bible calls us, Jesus calls us to follow Him and to be a member, to be a part of the community that is His church. It is impossible to follow Jesus and be separate from the community of believers, the community which is His church, which He has redeemed. And that's why it's important that we come to church, that we attend church, and be a part of the local church.